If you walked around the side of your grandmother's house in the summer of 1955, past the back porch and toward the far end of the yard, you would find something that most American backyards do not have anymore. Not a flower bed, not a lawn, a working garden, a patch of ground that earned its place by doing something useful every single day from April through October. Along the fence, there were things growing that you could not buy in any store in town, because nobody sold them. Nobody needed to sell them. You grew them yourself, the way your mother had grown them, and her mother before her. You knew what each one was for, you knew when to pick it, and you knew what happened if you did not. By the 1960s, supermarkets were changing the way American families thought about food. For the first time, you could buy herbs and vegetables in cans and jars and frozen packages, available year-round, for prices that made the labor of a garden feel unnecessary. One by one, the plants along the fence came out. The patch of ground became lawn. The knowledge of what had grown there went with the woman who had tended it, and when she was gone, so was everything she knew. These are the plants that were in that garden. Not all of them, but the ones that mattered most. The ones that did real work, that fed the family, and healed the sick, and kept the pests away, and made the winter survivable. Most of them are still out there, growing wild in fields and along roadsides, and in the corners of old properties, waiting for someone to recognize them. Mint was the first thing you smelled when you walked into that garden, and it was the first thing your grandmother would have planted there, because mint does not wait to be invited. Give it a corner of ground and it spreads. Give it a bed of its own, and it takes over the bed. Most women planted it in a buried container, an old coffee can, a clay pot sunk into the soil up to its rim, to keep it from swallowing the rest of the garden. But they always planted it, because mint was too useful to leave out. A handful of fresh mint leaves in a glass of water on a hot July afternoon was a drink that cost nothing and tasted like something from a good restaurant. Mint tea, made from leaves dried in the fall and stored in a tin through winter, soothed an upset stomach better than anything sold at the drugstore. A strong mint poultice pressed against a headache behind the eyes could take the edge off it in 20 minutes. Mint oil, rubbed along windowsills and door frames, kept ants out of the kitchen, and in a summer kitchen in the 1950s, keeping ants out of the kitchen was not a small problem. Here is something worth knowing. The peppermint and spearmint sold in stores today are bred for flavor consistency and yield, which means the essential oil concentration in a commercial mint leaf is often lower than what your grandmother was picking in her garden. The plants she grew were wilder, less uniform, and considerably more pungent. When she rubbed a leaf between her fingers and held it under your nose, the smell was not gentle. It was sharp and clean, and it cleared your head immediately. That was the point. Chamomile grew low to the ground, in a spreading mat of fine-leafed stems with small white daisy flowers that bloomed through most of the summer. Your grandmother picked the flowers in the morning when they had just opened, and the essential oils were strongest, spread them on a clean cloth in the shade to dry, and stored them in a glass jar with a tight lid. By November, that jar held enough dried flowers to make chamomile tea every evening through the winter. Chamomile tea was the answer to several different problems in the same cup. A child who could not settle at bedtime got a weak cup sweetened with a little honey, and it worked because the apigenin in chamomile genuinely binds to the same receptors in the brain that sleep medications target. Your grandmother did not know that, but the brain knew, and the child was usually asleep within the hour. A woman with menstrual cramps drank a stronger cup and found real relief, because chamomile has mild antispasmodic properties that reduce uterine cramping in ways that are now documented in medical literature. A man with an upset stomach from bad food or too much of something good drank a cup before bed and felt better by morning. German chamomile, which is the variety most American grandmothers grew, has been in continuous medicinal use for over 2,000 years. The ancient Egyptians used it. The Romans used it. The settlers who came to America brought the seeds with them because they were not willing to arrive in a new country without their medicine. Your grandmother's chamomile patch was the end of a very long line of people who understood that this particular small flower with the white petals and the yellow center was worth the space it took up. Lavender was the one that smelled like everything good about summer, and it did more work than it looked like it was doing. A established lavender plant in full bloom in July was a cloud of purple flower spikes above silver-grey leaves, and the fragrance was strong enough to carry across a yard. Your grandmother cut the stems just before the flowers fully opened, bundled them with twine, and hung them upside down in the pantry to dry. Those dried bundles went everywhere, into the linen closet between folded sheets, into the cedar chest with the winter woolens, into the drawer where the good tablecloths were kept. Moths do not like lavender. They never have. The dried flowers kept the moths away from the woolens for an entire winter, which was the practical reason your grandmother grew lavender. But it also meant that everything that came out of that cedar chest in October smelled like July. Lavender oil, pressed from the dried flowers by rubbing them between the palms and collecting the oil on the skin, was applied to burns and minor cuts, to insect bites and bee stings, and to temples for headaches. Research now confirms that lavender oil has measurable antimicrobial properties and reduces inflammation at the site of minor skin injuries. The military hospitals of World War I used lavender oil as an antiseptic when other supplies ran out. Your grandmother did not know any of that history. She knew that a dab of lavender oil on a bee sting stopped the burning faster than leaving it alone, and that was enough. Yarrow grew along the back fence in most American gardens of the 1950s, and children were specifically told not to pull it up because it looked like a weed, and it was not a weed. It was medicine, and the family needed it. Yarrow is a native North American plant with flat-topped clusters of tiny white flowers and feathery aromatic leaves that smell faintly of camphor. Your grandmother called it by a name that told you exactly what it was for: nosebleed plant, or staunchweed, or woundwort, depending on where in the country she had grown up. The dried leaves, crumbled and pressed directly into a bleeding cut, stopped the bleeding faster than almost anything else available in a household of that era. The plant contains compounds that promote blood clotting and also have mild antiseptic properties, which is why it had been used as a battlefield wound treatment since at least the time of the ancient Greeks. The scientific name, Achillea millefolium, refers to the legend that Achilles used it to treat his soldiers' wounds at Troy. A tea brewed from yarrow leaves and flowers broke a fever by promoting sweating. It opened the pores and let the heat out, which was understood by your grandmother's generation to be exactly how fever management worked, and which is, more or less, exactly correct. A poultice of fresh yarrow leaves pressed against a bruise reduced the swelling. Dried yarrow kept in a tin in the medicine cabinet was the backup plan for every minor injury that happened between the house and the barn, between the garden and the kitchen, between the beginning of a summer day and the end of it. Elderberry grew at the back of the property in most cases, against the fence or along the property line, because it got tall, 8 feet, sometimes more, and it spread by sending up new shoots from the roots every year until you had a thicket rather than a single plant. Your grandmother let it grow because in the fall, when the dark purple berries clustered in heavy, flat-topped bunches on every branch, she had work to do. The berries came down in September, stripped from the stems with a fork, washed, and cooked down into a thick, dark syrup with sugar, and sometimes a little cinnamon and cloves. That syrup went into small glass jars, sealed, and stored in the cellar. Through the winter, when somebody in the house started to feel the cold coming on, the scratchy throat, the ache behind the eyes, the general feeling of something arriving, a tablespoon of elderberry syrup twice a day was the first response. Before the aspirin came out, before anyone thought about calling the doctor. Here is what your grandmother knew by experience and what researchers later confirmed in clinical studies. Elderberry contains compounds called anthocyanins that have measurable antiviral properties, particularly against influenza viruses, and that reduce the duration and severity of cold and flu symptoms in a statistically significant way. A study published in the Journal of International Medical Research in 2004 found that elderberry extract reduced the duration of influenza illness by an average of 4 days compared to a placebo. 4 days. In a household in 1955, where a mother of 4 could not afford to be sick for a week, 4 days mattered enormously. The elderberry plant your grandmother had at the back fence was not decoration. It was the family pharmacy, and it produced its medicine once a year, in September, and it required almost no care at all to do it. Horseradish was the plant that no one in the neighborhood forgot, because you could smell it from across the yard when someone was grating the root, and the smell was not gentle. Horseradish is a perennial that grows easily to 3 feet tall, with large dark green leaves and a fleshy white root that goes deep into the ground and stays there indefinitely. You did not need to replant it. You planted it once, and it stayed, producing new root growth every year, getting larger and more established, until you had more horseradish than your family could use in a decade, and you were giving roots away to the neighbors every fall. Your grandmother grated the fresh root on a box grater, outside if possible, because the fumes from freshly grated horseradish are powerful enough to make your eyes water from a foot away, and mixed it with a little white vinegar to preserve the heat and stop the enzymatic reaction that would otherwise turn the grated root from white to brown. That jar of horseradish sauce went on the table with beef, with fish, with boiled potatoes on cold winter nights. A teaspoon of it, eaten at the first sign of a sinus infection, would clear the passages completely for about 20 minutes. It was not a cure, but for the 20 minutes it lasted, your grandmother considered it extremely satisfactory. Sage grew in a low mound near the kitchen door, silvery green and slightly rough to the touch, fragrant in a dry, piney way that was completely different from the refrigerator-cold sage sold in plastic packages today. Your grandmother used fresh sage the way a painter uses a signature, a few leaves in the butter when she cooked pork chops, a handful stuffed inside the turkey at Thanksgiving, 3 or 4 leaves sautéed in olive oil until they crisped at the edges, and then laid over the pasta on Sunday. The flavor was stronger than anything from a jar, and it was free, and it was 10 steps from the kitchen door. Here is what the sage near the kitchen door also did, that had nothing to do with cooking. A sage tea made from the fresh leaves, sweetened with honey, was the standard household treatment for a sore throat. The essential oils in sage have genuine antimicrobial properties. Sage was used as a disinfectant in European hospitals as recently as the early 20th century. A strong infusion of sage leaves pressed against a small cut or abrasion reduced the risk of infection in a time before every household had antibiotic ointment in the medicine cabinet. Your grandmother grew sage because it made the pork chops taste better. It kept working long after the dishes were done. Here is the bigger thing underneath all of it. The garden at the back of your grandmother's house in 1955 was not a hobby. It was not something she did for relaxation or because she enjoyed being outdoors, though she may have enjoyed it. It was an operating system for a household that could not afford to be unprepared. The mint kept the ants out. The chamomile put the children to sleep. The yarrow stopped the bleeding. The elderberry shortened the winter illness. The lavender kept the moths away from the woolens and the burns from getting infected. The horseradish cleared the sinuses and went on the Sunday table. The sage healed the throat and flavored the pork. Every plant in that garden had a reason to be there, and the reason was not sentiment. It was utility. The accumulated knowledge of women who had grown these things for generations and understood, without needing a study to confirm it, that each one did something nothing else could do as well or as cheaply. The supermarket did not replace that garden. It made the garden seem unnecessary, which is a different thing entirely. The frozen peas were easier than fresh ones. The dried sage in the jar was good enough. The cough syrup from the pharmacy was more convenient than the elderberry syrup in the cellar. One by one the plants came out, and one by one the knowledge went with them, and by the time anyone thought to ask where it had gone, the woman who held it was gone too. But the plants are still there. Mint still spreads. Chamomile still blooms. Elderberry still fruits in September, reliably, every year, along fences and roadsides and the back edges of old properties, waiting for someone who remembers what it was for. Memory Lane, America, one story at a time.